Sloane's hands trembled as she approached table 12, the corner booth where Pinnacle Industries CEO Rhett Garrison sat with his executive team. The restaurant's most expensive section, the kind of place where a single mistake could cost her everything. She'd worked 3 jobs to afford tonight's server uniform, pressing it until every crease disappeared. But Rhett's cold eyes swept over her like she was invisible furniture. When she spoke, her slight southern accent, barely noticeable after years in the North, caught his attention. "Could you repeat that?" His voice dripped condescension. In proper English this time. The room went silent. Sloane felt the familiar burn of humiliation rising in her chest. But Rhett Garrison had no idea who he was really talking to. The business card hidden in her apron pocket felt like a loaded weapon. Some underestimations, she thought, would cost more than others. The Sterling restaurant buzzed with the kind of controlled chaos that only comes from serving New York's elite. Sloane Barrett adjusted her black apron one final time before stepping into the dining room, where million-dollar deals were sealed over $30 appetizers. She wondered how many viewers watching her story unfold from their own workplaces could relate to the weight of serving those who looked down on them. The chandeliers cast harsh shadows across mahogany tables, each one representing more wealth than most people saw in a lifetime. Tonight felt different somehow, charged with an electricity that made her skin prickle. She'd been working at the Sterling for 3 months now, long enough to recognize the patterns of power that flowed through its hallways like expensive wine. The wealthy came here not just to eat, but to display their dominance, to remind themselves and others of their place in the social hierarchy. Sloane had learned to navigate these waters carefully, her journalism training teaching her to observe everything while revealing nothing. Her southern accent, softened by years of conscious effort, still occasionally betrayed her humble beginnings, something she'd learned to both embrace and strategically deploy. The evening rush at the Sterling was in full swing when Sloane noticed the reservation for table 12, Pinnacle Industries, a name that had been circling through her investigative research for weeks. Rhett Garrison, the company's CEO, had booked the corner booth, the restaurant's most secluded and expensive section. Sloane felt her pulse quicken as she smoothed her black uniform and checked the small recording device hidden beneath her collar. 3 months of undercover work had led to this moment, though she hadn't expected the opportunity to present itself quite so directly. The dining room's ambient lighting cast long shadows across polished marble floors, while the soft murmur of conversation created a backdrop of affluent comfort. Crystal glasses clinked like tiny bells, and the scent of truffle oil and aged wine hung heavy in the air. Sloane had spent countless hours studying Pinnacle Industries' environmental violations, their pattern of worker discrimination, and their CEO's reputation for treating employees like disposable assets. Tonight, she would finally see Rhett Garrison up close. When Rhett arrived with his executive team, Sloane immediately recognized Beckett Stone and Lawson Hunt from the corporate headshots she'd memorized. They moved through the restaurant with the casual arrogance of men who'd never questioned their right to take up space. Rhett commanded attention without trying, tall, silver-haired, wearing a suit that cost more than most people's monthly rent. His laugh boomed across the dining room as he shook hands with other patrons, a politician's smile never leaving his face. Sloane watched from the service station as Delaney Cross, the restaurant manager, personally escorted them to table 12. The way Delaney's posture straightened and her voice pitched higher in their presence spoke volumes about the power dynamics at play. Even here, in this temple to luxury, there were those who served, and those who ruled. Sloane picked up her order pad and water pitcher, steeling herself for what was to come. She'd faced down corrupt politicians and corporate executives before, but never while wearing a server's uniform and pretending to be someone she wasn't. The walk to table 12 felt like a gauntlet. Other servers, including her colleagues Easton Ford and Quinn Palmer, watched nervously as she approached the power table. They'd all heard stories about demanding VIP customers, but Pinnacle Industries carried a particular reputation for treating service staff poorly. Sloane's training in investigative journalism had taught her to read people quickly, to identify their weaknesses and motivations within minutes of meeting them. As she approached the table, she could already sense Rhett's need to dominate every interaction, the way his eyes swept dismissively over anyone he deemed beneath his status. Beckett and Lawson flanked him like loyal courtiers, their body language deferential despite their own considerable wealth and influence. The booth itself seemed designed for intimidation, high-backed leather seats that created a sense of enclosure, dim lighting that made reading facial expressions difficult. Sloane took a deep breath and stepped into the lion's den, her southern accent carefully modulated to sound appropriately humble. "Good evening, gentlemen. Welcome to the Sterling. I'm Sloane, and I'll be taking care of y'all tonight." The words came out exactly as she'd rehearsed them, with just enough of her natural accent to sound authentic, but not so much as to seem unprofessional. She'd calculated this moment carefully, knowing that her background would likely trigger Rhett's classist tendencies. The slight widening of his eyes told her she'd judged correctly. "Can I start y'all with some beverages, or would you prefer to hear about tonight's specials?" She maintained steady eye contact, her journalism training helping her project confidence even as her heart hammered against her ribs. The recording device beneath her collar felt warm against her skin, a reminder of her true purpose here. This wasn't just about serving drinks and taking orders. This was about gathering evidence of the systematic discrimination she'd been investigating for months. Rhett's response came faster than she'd expected, his voice cutting through the ambient restaurant noise like a blade. "Could you repeat that?" His tone carried the particular brand of condescension reserved for those he considered intellectually inferior. In proper English this time. The words hung in the air between them, loaded with implications that went far beyond simple communication. Beckett and Lawson shifted uncomfortably in their seats, but neither made any move to intervene. The silence stretched for what felt like an eternity, though Sloane's journalistic instincts told her it was probably only 3 or 4 seconds. She could feel the eyes of other diners turning toward their table, drawn by the sudden tension. The chandeliers above seemed to dim slightly, as if the very air itself was holding its breath. Sloane's fingers tightened almost imperceptibly around her order pad, but her expression remained professionally neutral. This was it, the moment she'd been preparing for without even knowing it. The moment when Rhett Garrison would reveal exactly who he was, giving her the ammunition she needed to bring him down. "Of course, sir," Sloane replied, her voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her veins. She deliberately allowed her accent to become more pronounced, playing into his expectations while simultaneously documenting his prejudice. "I was just asking if y'all would like to start with some beverages this evening, or if you'd prefer to hear about our chef's special preparations." She watched as Rhett's jaw tightened, his eyes narrowing with the satisfaction of someone who believed they'd successfully asserted their dominance. The other executives looked anywhere but at her face, their discomfort palpable, but their loyalty to their boss preventing any intervention. Around them, the restaurant continued its elegant dance of service and consumption. But Sloane felt as though she and Rhett were locked in a bubble of tension that excluded the rest of the world. She'd studied him for months through newspaper articles and corporate filings, but seeing his casual cruelty up close was different. This wasn't just business to him, it was personal. It was about maintaining a social hierarchy that placed him at the top and people like her at the bottom. And he would defend that hierarchy with every tool at his disposal. The business card in her apron pocket seemed to burn against her hip, a tangible reminder of her real identity and purpose. Professor Iris Caldwell had given it to her just yesterday, along with final approval for the investigation that had consumed her life for the past 6 months. Sloane Barrett, investigative journalist, was about to disappear completely behind the facade of Sloane the waitress. But unlike the humble server Rhett thought he was intimidating, this Sloane had weapons he couldn't imagine. She had sources in the Environmental Protection Agency, contacts at the Department of Labor, and a network of former Pinnacle Industries employees who were eager to tell their stories. Most importantly, she had the skills to weave all of this information into a narrative that would expose Rhett's crimes to the world. The recording device captured every word, every inflection, every moment of casual cruelty that he thought would go unwitnessed. As she prepared to take their drink orders, Sloane allowed herself a tiny smile. Rhett Garrison was about to learn that some people fought back, and that underestimating your opponent was the first step toward your own destruction. Rhett's laughter carried across the dining room like the sound of breaking glass, harsh and cutting.
"Did everyone hear that? Y'all would like some beverages?"
He mimicked Sloane's accent with exaggerated drawl, transforming her words into a caricature of Southern ignorance. "I feel like I'm ordering dinner in a roadside diner instead of Manhattan's finest establishment." Beckett Stone shifted uncomfortably in his leather seat, his eyes darting between Rhett and Sloane with obvious embarrassment. But he remained silent. Lawson Hunt actually winced, though he quickly covered it by reaching for his water glass. The power dynamics at play were clear. Even these wealthy executives knew their boss was crossing a line, but none had the courage to challenge him. Other diners at nearby tables began to notice the commotion, their conversations dropping to whispers as they strained to hear what was happening at table 12. The elegant atmosphere of the Sterling suddenly felt brittle, as if one wrong word might shatter the veneer of civilization that barely contained the ugliness beneath.
"Sir, I apologize if my accent is difficult to understand,"
Sloane replied, her voice maintaining its professional composure even as she felt heat rising in her cheeks. She'd expected this kind of response, had even prepared for it, but experiencing the public humiliation firsthand was still jarring. "I can certainly adjust my speech to better serve your needs." The words tasted like ash in her mouth, but she forced them out anyway. Every journalist learned early in their career that sometimes you had to swallow your pride to get the story. The recording device beneath her collar captured every syllable of Rhett's mockery, every moment of casual cruelty that revealed his true character. Around the dining room, she could see other servers watching nervously, their own job security suddenly feeling precarious. If this was how Rhett treated someone at the Sterling, one of the city's most prestigious establishments, what did he do to employees at his own company? The question hung in the air like smoke, invisible but impossible to ignore. From the service station, Sloane caught sight of Easton Ford's sympathetic expression and Quinn Palmer's barely controlled anger. Both had witnessed similar scenes before. Wealthy customers who treated service staff like entertainment rather than human beings. But neither could intervene without risking their own employment, a calculation that Rhett understood and exploited. Delaney Cross appeared at the edge of Sloane's peripheral vision, her managerial instincts clearly torn between protecting her employee and maintaining the restaurant's relationship with a high-profile customer. The silence stretched uncomfortably as everyone waited to see how far Rhett would push his advantage. His eyes glittered with the particular satisfaction of a predator who'd found easy prey, someone he could torment without consequences. The chandeliers cast harsh shadows across his face, transforming his features into a mask of entitled cruelty. This was power in its rawest form, not the kind that built companies or created jobs, but the kind that existed solely to diminish others. "You know what?" Rhett continued, his voice carrying the false joviality of someone enjoying a private joke. "Maybe you could practice some proper pronunciation while you're taking our order. Think of it as professional development." The suggestion dripped with condescension, transforming an ordinary restaurant interaction into a twisted masterclass in humiliation. "Let's start simple. Can you say, 'Good evening, distinguished guests. How may I assist you this evening?' And please, enunciate clearly. Pretend you actually finished high school." The words hit like physical blows, each one calculated to strip away another layer of dignity. Beckett actually flinched at the high school comment, his own working-class background probably making him more sensitive to such attacks. But fear of Rhett's retaliation kept him silent, complicit in the ongoing torture. The other diners had abandoned any pretense of eating, their attention fully focused on the drama unfolding at table 12. Some looked horrified by Rhett's behavior, while others seemed grimly entertained by the spectacle of someone being put in their place. Sloane felt something cold and sharp settle in her chest. Not just anger, but a crystalline clarity that cut through the humiliation and shame. This was exactly what she'd come here to find, the evidence she needed to expose Rhett's true nature to the world. "Good evening, distinguished guests," she repeated slowly, her accent deliberately thick and her words carefully measured. "How may I assist you this evening?" Each syllable felt like a weapon being loaded, ammunition she would use to destroy him when the time came. The recording device captured everything, Not just his words, but the laughter from his associates, the uncomfortable silence from other diners, the complete breakdown of basic human decency that money and power seem to enable. She could already imagine how this scene would sound to a jury, to a congressional committee, to the millions of people who worked service jobs and faced this kind of treatment every day. Rhett thought he was teaching her a lesson about knowing her place, but he was actually providing her with the tools of his own destruction. Much better, Rhett declared with mock approval, clapping his hands together like a teacher praising a slow student. See? With a little effort, anyone can learn to speak properly. Now I think we're ready for those beverages. I'll have the Macallan 25, neat. And please, when you bring it, try to remember that this is a business dinner, not a backyard barbecue. His companions laughed nervously, the sound hollow and forced. Around the dining room, the reaction was more subdued. Embarrassed silence from some tables, disgusted head-shaking from others. A few diners actually got up and left, their appetites apparently ruined by the display. The Sterling's carefully cultivated atmosphere of refined elegance was cracking under the weight of Rhett's cruelty, revealing the ugly power structures that luxury often concealed. Sloane nodded professionally and moved to collect the rest of their drink orders, her mind already working on how she would craft this scene in her eventual article. She had him now, not just his words, but his complete character laid bare for the world to see. All she had to do was continue playing her part until she had enough evidence to bury him completely. As Sloane returned with their drinks, she noticed that Rhett had transformed back into the polished businessman, his cruelty tucked away like a switchblade, returning to its sheath. The expensive whiskey seemed to mellow his mood, or perhaps he simply felt he'd established the proper hierarchy and could now proceed with business. "Gentlemen, let's discuss the Clearwater project," he said, pulling out a folder thick with documents. "Our friends from Meridian International are very interested in our environmental compliance measures." The irony wasn't lost on Sloane. Here was a man who just displayed breathtaking ignorance about human decency, now discussing environmental responsibility. She lingered near their table, refilling water glasses and straightening place settings with the practiced invisibility of experienced service staff. Her journalism training had taught her to be a shadow when necessary, to blend into backgrounds until people forgot she existed. It was a skill that had served her well in countless investigations, and tonight, it would prove invaluable. Beckett Stone spread several charts across the white tablecloth, his voice dropping to the conspiratorial whisper that wealthy men used when discussing questionable deals. "The EPA inspection is scheduled for next month, but our contact there has assured us we'll have advance notice of exactly what they're looking for." Sloane's hand stilled on the water pitcher as the implications hit her. This wasn't just corporate malfeasance. This was active corruption of federal regulators. She forced herself to continue her serving duties while her mind raced with the possibilities. Every investigative journalist dreamed of stumbling across this kind of smoking gun evidence, the kind of conversation that brought down entire corporations. The recording device beneath her collar was capturing every word, every admission of guilt that Rhett and his associates were casually sharing over their $40 appetizers. They talked about bribing government officials the way other people discussed weekend golf plans, with the easy confidence of men who'd never faced consequences for their actions. "The Clearwater facility handles our most sensitive operations," Rhett continued, swirling his whiskey thoughtfully. "Heavy metals processing, chemical waste management, the kind of work that keeps America running but makes environmental activists hysterical." He chuckled at his own perceived wit, apparently finding humor in the pollution of groundwater supplies. "Meridian wants assurance that we can continue operations even if regulatory pressure increases. They're particularly concerned about that new groundwater protection bill working its way through Congress." Lawson Hunt nodded gravely, consulting his tablet for specific details. "Our lobbyists are confident they can kill the bill in committee, but we need contingency plans. The local community has been asking too many questions about elevated cancer rates in the area." The casual dismissal of human suffering in favor of profit margins made Sloane's stomach turn. But she maintained her professional demeanor. These men weren't just criminals. They were monsters who measured their success by how much damage they could inflict while avoiding accountability. Sloane moved to the next table, close enough to continue listening while appearing to focus on her other customers. The wealthy couple dining nearby seemed oblivious to the confession of environmental crimes happening just feet away, too absorbed in their own concerns about summer house renovations to notice that their neighbors were discussing the poisoning of entire communities. It was a perfect metaphor for how these crimes persisted, hidden in plain sight, discussed openly among perpetrators who knew their victims lacked the power to stop them. The key is maintaining plausible deniability, Rhett explained to his companions. We follow the letter of the law while finding creative interpretations that serve our purposes. Environmental regulations are written by lawyers for lawyers. There's always wiggle room if you know where to look. His expertise in circumventing environmental protection revealed years of practice, a systematic approach to corporate crime that had probably poisoned countless communities while generating massive profits. When she returned to refill their wine glasses, Sloane caught fragments of an even more damaging conversation about workers' safety violations. The Occupational Safety and Health Administration fines are just a cost of doing business, Beckett was saying, his voice matter-of-fact despite discussing policies that endangered human lives. We factor them into our quarterly projections alongside equipment maintenance and insurance premiums. Rhett nodded approvingly, clearly pleased with his protégé's callous calculation. Exactly. A $50,000 fine is nothing compared to the millions we'd lose implementing proper safety protocols. Our shareholders understand that profitability requires accepting certain calculated risks. The euphemistic language couldn't disguise what they were really discussing. A deliberate decision to prioritize profits over human safety, to treat worker injuries and deaths as acceptable losses in pursuit of higher quarterly earnings. Sloane's journalistic instincts screamed that this was the kind of story that could topple governments and reshape entire industries. The recording device captured every admission, every casual discussion of crimes that affected thousands of people. Sloane's mind was already working on how to verify these claims, which sources she could contact to confirm the details of Rhett's various schemes. She had contacts at the EPA, former Pinnacle Industries employees who'd been blacklisted for raising safety concerns, and community activists who'd been fighting the company's environmental violations for years. This conversation would give her the roadmap she needed to expose the full scope of Rhett's criminal enterprise. The beauty of our current approach, Rhett continued, warming to his subject like a professor discussing a favorite theory, is that we're operating completely within the existing legal framework. Congress writes laws full of loopholes. Federal agencies are understaffed and underfunded, and local communities lack the resources to challenge us effectively. It's not illegal if you're smart enough to work the system. His smugness was overwhelming. The satisfaction of a man who believed he'd outsmarted everyone while destroying lives for personal gain. As the evening progressed, Sloane gathered more evidence than she'd dared hope for. Their conversation ranged from specific instances of regulatory capture to broader discussions of how corporate power could be wielded to avoid accountability. They discussed bribing local officials, intimidating whistleblowers, and using legal technicalities to escape environmental cleanup responsibilities. Each revelation was more damaging than the last, building toward a case that would be impossible to defend or explain away. But perhaps most importantly, their discussion revealed the systematic nature of Rhett's crimes. This wasn't a few isolated incidents, but a comprehensive approach to corporate criminality that touched every aspect of his business operations. The man who'd mocked her accent was the same man who poisoned communities for profit, who treated human lives as disposable obstacles to wealth accumulation. The recording device beneath her collar felt warm against her skin, loaded with enough evidence to destroy him completely. All she had to do now was survive the rest of the evening without revealing her true identity. Sloane's apartment felt like a war room as she spread documents across every available surface, transforming her living space into an investigative command center. The recording from the Sterling played through her headphones for the fourth time, each listen revealing new layers of criminality in Rhett's casual admissions. Her laptop screen glowed in the darkness, displaying EPA violation reports, OSHA complaint filings, and congressional testimony from environmental activists who'd been fighting Pinnacle Industries for years. The digital clock showed 3:17 in the morning, But sleep was impossible when she was this close to breaking the biggest story of her career. Coffee cups and energy drink cans littered her desk alongside printed emails, phone records, and financial documents that painted a picture of systematic corruption spanning multiple federal agencies. This wasn't just one corrupt CEO. This was an entire network of complicit officials who'd been bought and paid for with corporate money. The scope of the conspiracy was staggering, reaching into the highest levels of government and affecting communities across multiple states. Her phone buzzed with a text message from a contact at the EPA, another breadcrumb in the trail that led back to Rhett's environmental crimes. Can confirm Clearwater facility inspection was postponed 3 times in past 6 months, always for scheduling conflicts that seemed to coincide with campaign contributions. The pattern was unmistakable once you knew where to look. Sloane cross-referenced the inspection dates with Pinnacle Industries' political contributions and found a perfect correlation. Every time an EPA inspection was scheduled, a suspicious donation appeared in the campaign coffers of the relevant oversight committee members. It was corruption so blatant that it bordered on comedy, except for the devastating human cost of the delayed inspections. Communities downstream from Pinnacle facilities were reporting elevated cancer rates, birth defects, and respiratory problems that directly correlated with the company's illegal dumping practices. While Rhett's corporate lawyers delayed regulatory enforcement, real people were suffering and dying from preventable diseases. The deeper she dug, the more extensive the criminal network became. Former Pinnacle Industries employees had been reaching out through encrypted messaging apps, sharing stories of retaliation and intimidation that kept whistleblowers silent for years. Marcus Chen, a former quality control engineer, had been blacklisted from the entire industry after reporting safety violations that could have prevented a chemical plant explosion in Ohio. Sarah Rodriguez, a former environmental compliance officer, had been subjected to death threats and sexual harassment after documenting illegal waste disposal practices. The pattern was consistent. Anyone who tried to expose Pinnacle's crimes faced swift and brutal retaliation that destroyed their careers and endangered their families. Rhett's organization didn't just break environmental and safety laws. They systematically terrorized anyone who tried to hold them accountable. The recording from the Sterling was damning, but these personal testimonies would add human faces to what could otherwise seem like abstract corporate misconduct. Sloane's investigation revealed that Rhett's influence extended far beyond environmental crimes into areas she'd never considered. Campaign finance records showed donations to judges hearing environmental cases, contributions to think tanks that produced favorable research about chemical safety, and payments to public relations firms that specialized in discrediting environmental activists. The man was running a shadow empire dedicated to avoiding accountability while maximizing harm to public health and environmental safety. Her journalism degree had prepared her for corporate malfeasance, but nothing could have prepared her for the sheer scale of Rhett's criminal enterprise. This wasn't just a story about one corrupt CEO. This was a story about how democracy itself could be purchased and perverted to serve private interests at public expense. The evidence was overwhelming, but presenting it in a way that the average reader could understand would require careful narrative construction and impeccable sourcing. Professor Iris Caldwell's response to Sloane's preliminary findings was immediate and emphatic. This is the kind of story that changes everything. We need to be absolutely certain of every fact, because they'll throw everything they have at discrediting us. Iris had been investigating corporate environmental crimes for decades, and her reputation for thorough, bulletproof journalism had made her untouchable, even when taking on the most powerful interests. Under her mentorship, Sloane had learned that the most important part of investigative journalism wasn't gathering evidence. It was presenting that evidence in a way that compelled action from people with the power to create change. The Rhett Garrison story had all the elements needed for maximum impact: a clear villain, innocent victims, government corruption, and environmental devastation. But it also had something more, a personal element that would make readers care about abstract issues like regulatory capture and environmental justice. The business card in Sloane's wallet felt heavier now that she knew exactly what kind of man Rhett Garrison really was. Tomorrow, she would return to the Sterling, not as a humble waitress hoping for decent tips, but as an investigative journalist with enough evidence to destroy him completely. The plan was elegant in its simplicity. She would use his own arrogance against him, let his need to dominate every interaction provide the rope he'd use to hang himself. The recording device had captured his casual cruelty, but tomorrow she would get something even better, his confession on camera, his complete character revealed for the world to see. She'd practiced the confrontation a dozen times in her head, anticipating his responses and preparing her countermoves like a chess grandmaster visualizing victory. The southern accent he'd mocked would become the voice that announced his downfall, and the waitress he'd humiliated would reveal herself as the journalist who ended his career. Justice, Sloane reflected as she finally closed her laptop, sometimes came with poetic symmetry that felt almost too perfect to believe. The morning light streaming through Sloane's apartment windows felt different somehow, charged with the electricity of impending confrontation. She stood before her bathroom mirror, watching her reflection transform from service industry, invisible, to investigative journalist, formidable. Gone was the humble waitress uniform, replaced by a tailored charcoal suit that spoke of serious professional credentials and unshakable confidence. The metamorphosis was more than cosmetic. It was psychological armor for the battle ahead. Her southern accent, deliberately suppressed for months of undercover work, would today become a weapon of its own. Every mocking comment Rhett had made about her background would be turned against him, transformed from shame into strength. The business cards in her briefcase bore her real name and professional credentials: Sloane Barrett, senior investigative journalist, with affiliations that would make Rhett's blood run cold. Professor Iris Caldwell had spent years building the kind of media reputation that made corporate criminals lose sleep, and today Sloane would step into that legacy. The recording device that had captured Rhett's crimes was now one piece of evidence in a comprehensive case that would reshape environmental law enforcement across the country. Professor Caldwell's office at Columbia felt like a sanctuary for truth-tellers, its walls lined with awards recognizing decades of fearless journalism. "You understand there's no turning back after today," Iris warned, her eyes serious despite the excitement underlying her words. "Rhett Garrison has destroyed careers, silenced witnesses, and corrupted government officials to protect his empire. Once you reveal yourself as his nemesis, you'll need protection that goes beyond what the media can provide." The weight of that responsibility settled on Sloane's shoulders like expensive fabric, substantial but not burdensome. She'd known from the beginning that taking on Pinnacle Industries would be dangerous, but the alternative, allowing Rhett's crimes to continue unchallenged, was unthinkable. The communities poisoned by his facilities deserved someone willing to fight for them, even if that fight came with personal risk. Her journalism career had always been about giving voice to the voiceless. And today, she would speak for thousands of people who'd been silenced by fear and corporate intimidation. The evidence they'd gathered was bulletproof, the sources were credible, and the public interest was undeniable. The plan they'd developed was both audacious and elegant. Sloane would return to the Sterling as an environmental consultant interested in helping Pinnacle Industries improve their compliance record. The irony was delicious. The same man who'd mocked her as an uneducated waitress would grovel for approval from someone he thought could help protect his criminal empire. The reservation was already made under her real name, complete with professional credentials that would impress even Rhett's skeptical nature. Environmental consulting was a lucrative field for former government employees, and Rhett would assume she was another bureaucrat looking to cash in on her regulatory knowledge. The recording equipment would be more sophisticated this time, professional-grade devices that would capture every nuance of his confession. But the real weapon would be psychological, watching his arrogance transform into panic as he realized exactly who he'd been underestimating. The waitress he'd humiliated would reveal herself as the journalist who'd been documenting his crimes, and his world would collapse in real time. Iris reviewed the legal protections they'd arranged with the kind of thoroughness that came from decades of fighting powerful enemies. The district attorney's office is standing by to review evidence of federal crimes. The EPA Inspector General has opened a formal investigation, and Senator Morrison's environmental subcommittee wants to schedule hearings within the week. The machinery of justice was already in motion, waiting only for Sloane's signal to begin the process of holding Rhett accountable. But perhaps more importantly, They'd arranged protection for the whistleblowers who'd risked everything to share their stories. Former Pinnacle employees like Marcus Chen and Sarah Rodriguez would finally have their day in court, their testimonies protected by legal immunity and media attention that made retaliation impossible. The network of corruption that had protected Rhett for years was about to crumble, exposed to sunlight that would make further crimes impossible. Today's confrontation would be more than personal vindication. It would be the beginning of systemic change that protected communities from corporate environmental criminals. The drive to the Sterling felt like traveling toward destiny rather than simply crossing Manhattan traffic. Sloane's hands were steady on the steering wheel, her mind clear and focused on the task ahead. She'd rehearsed this moment countless times, but the reality felt both more intense and more natural than she'd expected. The Southern accent she'd spent years softening would today be deployed with devastating precision, a reminder to Rhett that the people he dismissed as inferior might possess the power to destroy him. Her briefcase contained enough evidence to end multiple careers and send several people to federal prison, but the most important weapon was her voice, the voice he'd mocked, now prepared to announce his downfall to the world. The recording device was state-of-the-art, provided by a media organization that understood the importance of documenting conversations that would reshape environmental law. Everything was ready except for Rhett himself, who remained blissfully unaware that his victim had become his judge. The Sterling's elegant facade looked different in daylight, less imposing somehow, as if she were seeing it clearly for the first time. The doorman who'd ignored her when she was in uniform now nodded respectfully, recognizing the authority that expensive clothes and confident posture projected. Inside, the dining room felt smaller than it had during her undercover work. The intimidating atmosphere reduced to mere stage dressing for wealthy people playing elaborate games of dominance. Delaney Cross approached with professional warmth, her manner completely different from the cold calculation she'd displayed when Sloane was just another service employee. "Ms. Barrett, welcome to the Sterling. Mr. Garrison is waiting for you in the Meridian Room." The private dining area was reserved for the restaurant's most exclusive guests, soundproof and secluded from casual observation. It was perfect for what Sloane had planned. A final confrontation between predator and prey, except today the roles would be reversed. As she followed Delaney through the restaurant, Sloane caught sight of Easton and Quinn setting tables for the evening service, their familiar faces reminding her why this confrontation mattered beyond personal vindication. The Meridian Room's mahogany panels and crystal chandelier created an atmosphere of imperial grandeur, the kind of setting where powerful men made decisions that affected thousands of lives without ever considering the human cost. Rhett sat at the head of an enormous conference table, his posture radiating the confidence of someone accustomed to controlling every interaction. He'd arrived early, Sloane noted with professional satisfaction, a sign that her credentials had impressed him enough to warrant unusual punctuality. The expensive suit she'd researched for weeks was perfectly tailored. Her briefcase was Italian leather, and her business cards bore the logos of environmental organizations that carried serious weight in regulatory circles. To Rhett, she appeared to be exactly what he needed, a former government insider willing to help him navigate increasingly hostile environmental enforcement. His smile was warm and welcoming, a stark contrast to the cold cruelty he displayed toward the waitress he thought he'd never see again. The transformation was so complete that Sloane almost felt sorry for him, almost, but not quite enough to abandon her mission of justice. "Ms. Barrett, thank you for making time in your schedule," Rhett said, rising to shake her hand with the practiced charm of a man accustomed to winning people over. "Your reputation in environmental compliance consulting is impressive. Iris Caldwell speaks very highly of your work with regulatory agencies." The mention of Professor Caldwell's name was calculated bait, designed to make him overconfident about the meeting's purpose. Rhett's research had apparently confirmed that Sloane Barrett was a real person with legitimate credentials in environmental law, but he'd failed to dig deeper into her true profession. The irony was exquisite. His own arrogance had prevented him from conducting the kind of thorough background check that might have revealed her journalist identity. Instead, he saw only what he wanted to see: another bureaucrat looking to monetize government connections in the lucrative private sector. His eagerness was palpable as he gestured for her to take a seat at the polished table, completely unaware that he was positioning himself for execution. Sloane allowed herself to settle into the role of environmental consultant with the same skills she'd used to become an invisible waitress. "Mr. Garrison, I appreciate your interest in improving Pinnacle Industries' environmental compliance record. Too many companies wait until they're facing federal investigation before addressing these issues." Her voice was crisp and professional, with just enough Southern inflection to sound authentic, but not enough to trigger recognition. The recording device in her briefcase was already capturing every word, but she needed him to incriminate himself more thoroughly before revealing her true identity. "I understand you're particularly concerned about the Clearwater facility and its relationship with EPA oversight." Rhett's eyes lit up at the mention of his most problematic operation, clearly believing he'd found someone who could help him continue avoiding accountability. The dance they were performing felt almost choreographed, two actors playing roles that would culminate in his destruction. "Exactly," Rhett replied, leaning forward with conspiratorial intimacy. "The environmental activism industry has made compliance increasingly expensive, even when we're operating completely within legal parameters. I need someone who understands how regulations are actually enforced, not how they're written." His casual dismissal of environmental protection as an industry revealed everything about his mindset, the idea that clean air and water were luxuries rather than basic human rights. Sloane nodded sympathetically, encouraging him to continue digging his own grave with every word. "The Clearwater facility is crucial to our operations, but certain activist groups have been pressuring regulatory agencies to increase inspection frequency beyond what's reasonable or necessary." The euphemistic language couldn't disguise what he was really saying. He wanted help avoiding oversight that might reveal his crimes. Each admission was another nail in the coffin she was building, another piece of evidence that would make denial impossible when the time came. The conversation continued for 20 minutes. With Rhett providing increasingly damaging details about his approaches to regulatory avoidance. He discussed specific EPA officials who could be influenced, outlined strategies for delaying inspections, and even mentioned communities that had been unreasonably concerned about groundwater contamination. His confidence grew with each admission, clearly believing he'd found the perfect ally in his war against environmental accountability. Sloane encouraged his revelations with the kind of professional interest that made him feel validated and understood. The recording captured every nuance of his criminal methodology, every casual admission of guilt that would later be played for juries and congressional committees. But she was waiting for the perfect moment to reveal herself, the psychological climax that would transform his triumph into devastation. The waitress he'd humiliated was about to become his judge, and the accent he'd mocked would announce his downfall. When Rhett paused to refill their water glasses from an expensive crystal pitcher, Sloane seized her moment. "You know, Mr. Garrison, your approach to environmental compliance reminds me of something I witnessed recently." Her voice remained professionally neutral, but she allowed her Southern accent to become slightly more pronounced. "I was having dinner at a restaurant. Actually, it was right here at the Sterling. And I overheard the most fascinating conversation about regulatory capture and environmental crime." She watched his face carefully, looking for the first flicker of recognition that would signal his world was about to collapse. The discussion was incredibly detailed, almost like a confession of specific criminal activities. The participants seemed so confident that they were beyond accountability that they discussed their crimes openly, even in front of the service staff. Rhett's hand stilled on the water pitcher, his executive instincts finally detecting danger in what had seemed like casual conversation. "I'm not sure I understand the relevance," Rhett said slowly, his voice betraying the first hint of uncertainty she'd heard from him. The confidence that had carried him through decades of crime was beginning to crack as he processed the implications of her words. Sloane smiled with the kind of professional warmth that predators recognized in other predators, the expression of someone who'd been hunting him all along. "Oh, I think you understand perfectly, Mr. Garrison. You see, I was working at the Sterling that night, serving drinks and taking orders. You might remember me. I'm the waitress whose accent you found so amusing." The recognition hit him like a physical blow, his face going pale as he realized exactly who he'd been confessing to for the past half hour. The recording device captured his sharp intake of breath, the moment when supreme confidence transformed into absolute terror. The hunter had become the hunted, and there was nowhere left to run. The silence in the Meridian room stretched like a taut wire, vibrating with tension that seemed to make the crystal chandelier tremble overhead. Rhett's face cycled through expressions of disbelief, recognition, and dawning horror as the full implications of his situation crystallized in his mind. The confident businessman who'd entered the room 30 minutes earlier was rapidly disappearing, replaced by a cornered animal calculating escape routes from an impossible trap. Sloane watched the transformation with professional fascination, noting how quickly arrogance could transform into panic when the power dynamic shifted. "I believe you told me to speak properly, Mr. Garrison. Well, here's some proper English for you. You're about to be exposed as a criminal who's been poisoning communities and bribing officials for years." Her southern accent was now deliberate and pronounced, each syllable a reminder of the prejudice that had led to his downfall. The recording device captured every nuance of his reaction, preserving for posterity the moment when decades of criminal impunity came to an end. "You have no idea what you're dealing with," Rhett snarled, his mask of civility finally slipping to reveal the ugly reality beneath. "I have lawyers who eat little girls like you for breakfast. I have contacts in every regulatory agency, judges on multiple federal benches, and senators who owe me favors. You think one recording is going to bring down an empire I've spent 30 years building?" His threats carried the desperation of a man who'd never faced real consequences for his actions, someone so accustomed to intimidating opponents that he couldn't conceive of meeting someone beyond his reach. But his words also provided additional evidence of corruption, more ammunition for the criminal charges that were already being prepared. Every threat he made was another federal crime. Every admission of influence peddling another count in an indictment that was growing longer by the minute. Sloane's journalism training had taught her to remain calm under pressure, to let aggressive subjects reveal themselves through their own words rather than responding with matching hostility. Sloane reached into her briefcase with deliberate slowness, withdrawing a folder thick with documents that represented months of investigative work. "Actually, Mr. Garrison, I have much more than one recording. I have EPA violation reports that you thought were buried, OSHA complaint filings that disappeared from public databases, and testimony from former employees who were terrorized into silence." She spread the evidence across the polished conference table like a prosecutor presenting a case to a jury. "I have financial records showing payments to federal judges, campaign contributions that coincided with delayed inspections, and communications with lobbyists coordinating attacks on environmental legislation." Each document was a dagger aimed at his empire, meticulously researched and legally bulletproof. The scope of evidence was overwhelming, far beyond what any single individual should have been able to gather. But Sloane hadn't worked alone. She'd had help from a network of activists, whistleblowers, and government insiders who'd been waiting years for someone with the skills and courage to take on Pinnacle Industries. "This is impossible," Rhett whispered, his voice barely audible as he stared at the documentary proof of his crimes. "These files are classified, sealed by court order, or protected by attorney-client privilege. How could you possibly have access to this information?" The question revealed his fundamental misunderstanding of how investigative journalism worked when practiced by someone with Iris Caldwell's connections and Sloane's determination. Government sources who'd watched Rhett escape accountability for years had been eager to share information with someone who might finally hold him responsible. Environmental activists had preserved evidence that regulatory agencies had been forced to ignore. Former employees had kept copies of documents that Pinnacle's lawyers thought had been destroyed. The network of people damaged by Rhett's crimes was vast and motivated, and Sloane had given them a focal point for their collective desire for justice. His empire hadn't been as secure as he'd imagined. It had been held together by fear and corruption rather than legitimate authority. The transformation in Rhett's demeanor was complete as he realized the hopelessness of his situation. The threats gave way to pleading, the intimidation replaced by desperate attempts at negotiation. "Look, Ms. Barrett, clearly there's been some misunderstanding about my business practices. I'm sure we can reach some kind of arrangement that serves everyone's interests." The words tumbled out in a rush, his desperation overriding the calculated speech patterns that had served him for decades. Pinnacle Industries employs thousands of people, contributes millions to local economies, and provides essential services that keep American industry competitive. Surely you understand that destroying the company would hurt innocent workers more than it would affect me personally. The appeal to concern for employees was particularly galling coming from someone who'd systematically endangered those same workers' health and safety for profit. Every word he spoke provided additional evidence of his character, revealing a man who viewed human beings as disposable assets in his pursuit of wealth and power. Sloane's response was measured and devastating, delivered in the kind of calm, professional tone that made threats more frightening than shouting. "Mr. Garrison, those innocent employees you're suddenly concerned about deserve to work for a company that doesn't poison their communities and endanger their lives. They deserve leadership that follows environmental laws instead of circumventing them through corruption and intimidation." She gestured to the evidence spread across the table, each document representing lives damaged by his criminal enterprise. "The arrangement I'm offering is simple. You can cooperate with federal investigators, testify truthfully about your crimes, and help clean up the environmental damage you've caused. Or you can continue lying and face additional charges for obstruction of justice and witness tampering." The choice was illusory. She had enough evidence to convict him regardless of his cooperation, but offering him options maintained the pretense that he retained some control over his fate. In reality, his empire was already collapsing, undermined by the very arrogance that had made him careless enough to confess his crimes to someone he thought was beneath his notice. The final moments of their confrontation felt almost anticlimactic as Rhett's remaining resistance crumbled like a dam bursting under too much pressure. "You don't understand the forces you're unleashing," he said weakly, his voice carrying the hollow ring of a man who'd realized he'd lost everything. "There are powerful people who benefit from the current system, who won't appreciate having their arrangements disrupted by some crusading journalist with a grudge." His words were more prophecy than threat, an acknowledgement that Sloane's investigation would create consequences far beyond Pinnacle Industries. But those broader implications were exactly what she'd hoped to achieve: systematic change that made future environmental crimes more difficult to commit and conceal. The recording device captured his final admissions, the last pieces of evidence needed to ensure that his conviction was inevitable. Tomorrow, the world would learn about Rhett Garrison's crimes, and the communities he'd poisoned would finally have their day in court. The waitress he'd mocked had become the journalist who ended his career, and justice would be served with a Southern accent. The morning edition of the New York Times featured Sloane's exposé as the front-page story, with a headline that captured the dramatic irony of Rhett's downfall: "Environmental criminal exposed by waitress he mocked for accent." The article's publication triggered a cascade of consequences that seemed to accelerate with each passing hour, as if decades of suppressed accountability were suddenly rushing forward all at once. Federal prosecutors announced a comprehensive investigation within hours of the story breaking, while EPA administrator issued a statement promising immediate inspections of all Pinnacle Industries facilities. The stock market responded with brutal efficiency, driving Pinnacle's share price down 73% in the first day of trading as investors fled a company that now faced criminal liability across multiple federal agencies. But perhaps most satisfying was the personal dimension of justice, as Rhett's colleagues and business associates began distancing themselves from a man they'd previously courted for his influence and connections. The powerful friends who'd enabled his crimes for years suddenly developed convenient amnesia about their relationships with him. Within a week, Rhett found himself facing federal charges that carried potential prison sentences measured in decades rather than years. The Environmental Protection Agency filed civil penalties totaling $800 million for violations spanning 15 years of operations, while the Department of Justice pursued criminal charges for conspiracy, racketeering, and environmental terrorism. The speed with which the legal machinery moved reflected both the strength of Sloane's evidence and the eagerness of prosecutors to finally hold Pinnacle Industries accountable. Congressional hearings were scheduled across multiple committees, with Senator Morrison's Environmental Subcommittee leading the charge for comprehensive reform of environmental enforcement. The network of corruption that had protected Rhett began unraveling as federal investigators offered immunity deals to officials who cooperated with their inquiry. Former EPA administrators, federal judges, and lobbyists found themselves choosing between loyalty to Rhett and their own legal survival, and self-preservation won every time. The human dimension of justice was equally powerful as communities affected by Pinnacle's environmental crimes finally received the attention and support they deserved. Class action lawsuits filed on behalf of residents near Clearwater and other facilities now had the documentary evidence needed to prove causation between Pinnacle's illegal dumping and elevated cancer rates in surrounding areas. Medical monitoring programs were established to track long-term health effects, while federal Superfund designation triggered comprehensive environmental cleanup efforts. Most importantly, the voices of people who'd been silenced for years by fear and intimidation were finally being heard by audiences with the power to create change. Environmental justice activists who'd been dismissed as hysterical troublemakers were suddenly being consulted by congressional committees and federal agencies seeking to understand the full scope of Pinnacle's crimes. The southern communities that Rhett had assumed were too powerless to fight back proved to have allies in unexpected places. Sloane's professional recognition came swiftly and from the most prestigious sources in American journalism. The Pulitzer Prize Committee expedited their review process to honor her environmental investigation, while Columbia University offered her a faculty position alongside Professor Iris Caldwell. But perhaps more meaningful were the personal messages from former Pinnacle employees, environmental activists, and community leaders whose lives had been changed by her willingness to fight for justice. Marcus Chen, the engineer who'd been blacklisted for reporting safety violations, wrote to thank her for vindicating his courage in speaking truth to power. Sarah Rodriguez, the compliance officer who'd faced death threats for documenting illegal dumping, expressed gratitude for making their suffering meaningful through systemic change. The network of people who'd risked everything to expose Pinnacle's crimes had finally been vindicated, their sacrifices transformed into genuine progress toward environmental accountability. The Sterling restaurant itself became an unlikely symbol of how justice could emerge from the most unexpected circumstances, with management instituting new policies protecting service staff from customer abuse. Easton Ford and Quinn Palmer were promoted to supervisory positions, while Delaney Cross implemented training programs educating staff about their rights when facing harassment or discrimination. The dining room that had once felt like a temple to unchecked privilege now served as a reminder that power without accountability was ultimately fragile. Other high-end establishments across the city quietly revised their customer service policies, recognizing that tolerating abuse could expose them to legal liability if their guests turned out to be documenting criminal behavior. The ripple effects extended far beyond environmental law into broader questions about how service workers were treated by wealthy customers who assumed their social position made them immune to consequences. 6 months after the confrontation in the Meridian Room, Sloane returned to the Sterling as a patron rather than an employee, her transformation complete from undercover journalist to recognized expert in environmental crime. She sat at the same table where Rhett had humiliated her, now dining with federal prosecutors preparing for his criminal trial. The irony was perfect. The booth that had once symbolized his dominance now served as a strategy session for his prosecution. Through the restaurant's windows, she could see the Pinnacle Industries building where federal agents had executed search warrants and seized decades of incriminating documents. Rhett himself was under house arrest, his passport confiscated, and his assets frozen pending resolution of multiple criminal cases. The empire he'd built on environmental destruction and human suffering was being dismantled piece by piece, while the communities he'd poisoned finally received the resources needed for healing and recovery. The waitress he'd mocked for her accent had become the voice announcing his downfall, proving that underestimation could be the most expensive mistake a predator ever made. Justice, it turned out, sometimes came with a southern drawl and an investigative journalism degree. What started as one man's arrogance became a reminder that the people we dismiss as powerless might possess the very tools needed to hold us accountable. In a world where wealth and influence often shield criminals from consequences, sometimes justice arrives wearing a server's uniform and carrying a recorder. The voices that power tries to silence are often the ones that speak the loudest truths. If you've experienced workplace discrimination or environmental injustice in your community, remember that your story matters and your voice has power. Comment below if you're watching this from a workplace where you felt powerless. You might be surprised by who's paying attention.